Welcome to the Cozy Storytime, your peaceful space to unwind and relax. Before we start, make sure to subscribe and like the video for more cozy stories every night. Now, take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's drift into a peaceful slumber together. This time I will tell you about Alice in Wonderland. It was a peaceful, warm afternoon, and young Alice, a curious and adventurous girl, found herself resting beside the riverbank with her sister. The air was calm, the soft rustling of the leaves was the only sound that could be heard, and Alice felt a sense of boredom creeping in. Her sister was reading a book, but Alice, restless as ever, couldn't bring herself to enjoy the quiet stillness of the moment. The idea of sitting still felt almost unbearable to her. She longed for something more exciting, something to break the monotony of the peaceful day. Alice sat up, casting a glance across the river, her mind wandering. As she looked around, her eyes fell upon a curious sight, a rabbit. But not just any rabbit, a white rabbit, dressed in a waistcoat and carrying a pocket watch. This strange, almost out-of-place figure caught Alice's attention immediately. The rabbit, who appeared to be in a rush, murmured to itself, "Oh dear! Oh dear! I shall be too late." Intrigued, Alice couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder. Who was this rabbit? Why was it wearing clothes? And, most importantly, where was it going in such a hurry? Without hesitation, Alice decided to follow it. She stood up, her feet light with curiosity, and began walking quickly in the direction the rabbit had gone. The rabbit moved faster, darting through the bushes and out of sight, but Alice was determined. She ran faster too, her heart pounding with excitement as she followed it through the garden, across the meadow, and towards a large tree. Alice chased the rabbit through a small opening, and suddenly, the ground beneath her feet seemed to disappear. One moment, she was on solid ground, the next, she was falling down, down, down into what seemed like an endless abyss. It was as though the world around her had flipped upside down, and Alice could do nothing but fall. The walls of the hole were smooth, and there were no jagged rocks or rough edges to slow her descent. It was almost as though she were gliding gently down. As she fell, Alice couldn't help but marvel at the strange, surreal nature of the whole experience. How far was she going to fall? Was she dreaming? How long had she been falling? There were no answers to her questions, only the slow and steady plummet into what seemed like an unknown world. She looked around her as she fell, noticing that the walls of the hole were lined with shelves and cabinets, some holding books, others with curious little items, old-fashioned bottles, teacups, and maps. There were even some framed pictures hanging on the walls, depicting scenes that seemed too odd to make sense. Alice briefly wondered if this was all part of a dream, but the more she thought about it, the less certain she became. In the midst of her thoughts, Alice noticed that the air was becoming warmer as she fell. The space around her seemed to stretch out before her eyes, and as she continued her descent, she could see a faint light below. She felt a strange sensation, a mix of both fear and excitement, but she couldn't stop herself now. She had already committed to the chase. Finally, with a soft thud, Alice landed. To her surprise, she wasn't hurt at all. Instead, she stood up, brushing herself off, and looked around. She found herself in a long, narrow corridor, the walls lined with doors of all shapes and sizes. Most of them were locked, but there was one door, small and peculiar, that was slightly ajar. As she approached it, Alice could see that through the crack there was a beautiful garden beyond, a garden that seemed so bright and inviting, filled with vibrant colors and fragrant flowers. But how was she supposed to get through? The door was tiny, barely large enough for her to fit through, and she knew she wouldn't be able to enter the garden unless she could find a way to shrink. After all, she was far too big to fit through such a small opening. It was then that Alice noticed a glass bottle sitting on a small table beside her. The label read, "Drink me." The bottle looked inviting, and Alice hesitated for a moment. Was it safe? What if it was poisonous? But her curiosity got the better of her, and she uncorked the bottle, taking a small sip. Almost immediately, Alice felt a strange sensation. She looked down and saw that her body was shrinking. Slowly but surely, she began to shrink until she was small enough to slip through the door and into the garden beyond. Overcome with excitement, Alice hurriedly walked through the door, her heart racing with anticipation of what she would find next. As she entered the garden, the colors around her were more vivid than anything she had ever seen. The flowers seemed to wave at her, the grass was lush and green, and the trees were thick with beautiful, sprawling branches. There was a sense of serenity in the air, yet at the same time, Alice could sense that this was no ordinary place. Everything about it was strange, almost magical, and she couldn't help but feel that she had entered another world entirely, a world where anything was possible. However, her newfound sense of wonder didn't last long. As she began to explore the garden, Alice came across a large mushroom. A curious caterpillar sat atop it, smoking a hookah and looking at her with a bemused expression. The caterpillar, although calm and collected, seemed to exude an air of wisdom and mystery. It began speaking to Alice, though its words were cryptic and confusing. It told her that to navigate Wonderland, she would need to know how to change her size once again, this time with the help of the mushroom. But Alice's journey was only just beginning, and she realized that Wonderland, as beautiful and enchanting as it was also a place full of mysteries, questions, and challenges that she would need to unravel. Her adventure had only begun, and the strange world around her beckoned her to explore it further. As Alice continued to wander through Wonderland, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the edge of discovering something extraordinary, something that would change her forever. Each step she took felt like a step further into the unknown, and with every new encounter, the world around her seemed to grow even more bizarre, yet fascinating. The curious white rabbit that had led her here seemed like a distant memory now, but Alice couldn't help but wonder, had she truly followed the rabbit, or had the rabbit followed her into this strange, dreamlike world? One thing was certain, Wonderland had a way of leading people down paths that they never expected, and Alice was about to experience it all firsthand. After her encounter with the curious bottle labeled "Drink Me," Alice, now having shrunk down to a tiny size, was able to slip through the tiny door and enter a wonderful garden. However, her excitement quickly turned to confusion as she realized that her size would not remain stable for long, and the strange world of Wonderland was far from predictable. Alice had only just stepped into the garden when she noticed another challenge, her current size. While she had managed to squeeze through the door, she now found herself far too small to interact with the world as she would have liked. The flowers in the garden were like towering trees to her, and the tall grass seemed to stretch far above her head. Her tiny form made her feel vulnerable, and the wide expanse of Wonderland's landscape seemed all the more immense. However, Alice was nothing if not resourceful. Her first task was clear. She needed to change her size once more to navigate this strange and unfamiliar world. With this thought in mind, she retraced her steps back to the table where the small bottle had been left. She carefully examined it and was pleased to see that the bottle still contained a little liquid. This time, the bottle had a label that read, "Eat a me." Curious but cautious, Alice decided to try it. She took a small nibble of the cake and immediately she began to grow. But this time, she didn't stop growing at the same point. The sensation was odd. Her limbs felt stretched and her body seemed to elongate uncontrollably. She grew larger and larger until she found herself towering over the garden, her head nearly touching the tree branches. Her surroundings now looked small and far below her. Her height had become quite unwieldy, and she found herself struggling to move with ease. The flowers and shrubs, which had seemed so delightful before, now looked like tiny bits of grass scattered across the ground. Alice became frantic. She realized that she had grown far too large. In this oversized state, she found it difficult to maneuver through the world, and she started to feel desperate for a solution. As she stood amidst the towering plants, trying to find something to help her, Alice noticed a small door in the distance. The door was locked, but through the crack, she could still see the beautiful garden beyond, the very place she had first entered when she had been small enough to fit through the door. She longed to return to that space, but she was now too large to pass through. What Alice needed now was balance. She needed to return to a more manageable size. Her initial instinct was to once again seek out the mushroom she had passed earlier in her journey. She recalled that the caterpillar sitting on the mushroom had told her that eating a portion of it would allow her to change size, but she could not remember the exact instructions. So, she turned around and began to make her way back, hoping to find some clarity along the way. After a few moments of struggling through the dense vegetation, Alice finally spotted the mushroom again. The caterpillar, who had been smoking a hookah, was still there. His lazy, yet wise eyes looked at her without much surprise, as if he had been expecting her return. He greeted Alice in his usual slow and somewhat aloof manner, though he did not seem bothered by her predicament. Alice, now overwhelmed by her size and the oddity of her situation, asked the caterpillar, "How can I shrink back down? I don't want to be so tall. How do I make myself the right size again?" The caterpillar, who had seemingly been deep in thought, lazily exhaled smoke from his hookah before answering. "One side will make you grow, and the other will make you shrink. But you must decide how much. Take it slowly." With that cryptic statement, the caterpillar showed Alice the mushroom, instructing her to eat a small piece of it. He then casually added, "But be careful. If you're not sure, you may end up being too small or too large. It's all about balance." Feeling a sense of determination, Alice reached for the mushroom. She carefully tore off a piece and took a small bite. To her relief, she began to shrink down almost immediately. She continued eating small portions until she was at a size that seemed just right, not too big, not too small, but the perfect height to explore the peculiar world around her. Feeling more comfortable in her new form, Alice took a moment to collect herself. She stood tall in the middle of the strange garden, her eyes scanning the landscape with a sense of wonder. It was as if the garden had become more familiar now that she was in a size that fit more naturally within it. The flowers, once towering above her, now appeared as they should, vibrant and colorful, swaying gently in the breeze. However, Alice was not content simply to remain in the garden. There was so much more to discover, so much more to learn about this new world. She decided to continue her exploration and ventured further into the garden, taking in every strange and beautiful detail. As she walked through the vibrant space, she noticed that the world seemed to pulse with magic. The flowers whispered to one another, the trees seemed to stretch and bend in unusual ways, and there was an overall sense of wonder in the air. Suddenly, as she wandered deeper into the garden, she heard a rustling noise from a nearby bush. Alice paused, her curiosity piqued once again. She peered into the foliage and saw the white rabbit darting by, still carrying his pocket watch and muttering to himself in a hurried tone. "Oh dear! Oh dear! I shall be too late," the rabbit said, darting across Alice's path with his characteristic haste. Once again, Alice felt compelled to follow the white rabbit. She didn't know why. Perhaps it was because he was the first inhabitant of Wonderland she had encountered, or maybe it was the fact that he seemed to know something that Alice did not. Whatever the reason, Alice's curiosity once again overtook her, and she began to chase after him. She followed the rabbit through the garden, weaving around the towering plants and flowers, her eyes fixed on the rabbit as it scurried ahead. The rabbit moved quickly, almost as if he knew she was following him, and with each step, Alice became more determined to find out where he was going and why he seemed so anxious. The rabbit led Alice to a small clearing in the garden, where she saw an even stranger sight, a large, very unorthodox tea party. The table was set with mismatched chairs, teacups, and plates. Several peculiar figures were sitting at the table, including a Mad Hatter, a March Hare, and a sleepy dormouse. Alice's pursuit of the white rabbit was about to lead her into yet another bizarre and perplexing situation, one that would challenge her perception of Wonderland even further. But for now, as she stood before the tea party, she felt a mix of excitement and curiosity bubbling inside her. As Alice stood in the clearing, her eyes widened in awe at the sight before her. The scene was like something out of a dream, an image so surreal that she almost couldn't believe it. A long, wooden table, set with mismatched teacups, saucers, and plates, stretched out before her. It was as though every item was plucked from different times, places, and realities. The table was piled high with food, teapots, and teacups in all shapes and sizes. Some of the cups seemed too large, while others were impossibly tiny. The entire table was covered with what appeared to be a never-ending supply of tea, cakes, and sandwiches. Seated around the table were three of the most peculiar individuals Alice had ever seen, a March Hare, a Dormouse, and the Mad Hatter. Each of them had an unusual manner about them, and there was something distinctly off about their behavior. The March Hare, who was wearing a shabby coat and a cravat, was eagerly pouring tea from one teapot to another, moving at a pace that was almost too fast to follow. His white eyes darted about nervously, and his hands trembled as he passed the teacups to those seated with him. He appeared to be perpetually on edge, as though he could not sit still for even a moment. Next to him sat the Mad Hatter, who wore a large top hat adorned with a curious card reading in his style 10/6. He looked as though he had just stepped out of a fashion catalog for the eccentric. His face was pale and his eyes were wide, constantly shifting between extreme focus and bursts of excitement. He tapped the edge of his teacup nervously and gestured wildly with his hands, as though the conversation at the table was both immensely important and completely irrelevant at the same time. The Dormouse, on the other hand, was fast asleep. At least, it seemed to be asleep. Its tiny body lay curled up in the center of the table, resting against a teacup. The little creature barely moved, except for an occasional snore or twitch, as if it were oblivious to everything happening around it. The other two didn't seem to mind. In fact, they acted as though it were completely normal for a dormouse to be napping at such an important gathering. Alice, unsure of what to do next, cautiously approached the group. The Mad Hatter, noticing her approach, looked up from his teacup and greeted her enthusiastically, though his greeting was far from conventional. "Why, hello there, my dear," the Hatter exclaimed. "How wonderful to see a new face at our party. You must sit down at once. No need to stand around like a statue." Alice hesitated, glancing around the table, unsure of where she should sit. She looked at the empty chairs, each one seemingly more eccentric than the last, but she couldn't bring herself to pick one. It seemed that no matter which chair she chose, it would somehow add to the madness of the situation. The March Hare noticed her hesitation and immediately began to offer her a seat. He pointed to a chair next to the Hatter, but as he did, he knocked over a cup of tea in his excitement. The tea splashed everywhere, covering the table in a warm, wet mess. The Hare didn't seem to mind and simply moved on, pouring more tea into the cups. "Do sit down. Do sit down. There's plenty of room," the March Hare insisted, his voice high-pitched and frantic. Finally, Alice, feeling the pressure of their insistence, sat down at the table. She found herself placed between the Hatter and the Dormouse, neither of whom seemed to notice or care much about her presence. Alice looked around the table once more, unsure of what to make of the bizarre scene. The teacups were constantly being refilled, and the conversation seemed to jump from topic to topic with little to no logic. The Hatter, noticing that Alice hadn't yet taken a drink, asked in his eccentric manner, "Would you like some tea, my dear?" Alice, still trying to process the oddity of the situation, nodded politely. "Yes, I suppose I would, thank you." But just as she reached for a teacup, the March Hare jumped up and began pouring more tea into the already overflowing cups. Alice felt herself getting overwhelmed by the sheer speed and chaos of the tea party, but she couldn't bring herself to leave either. The entire experience was both maddening and intriguing at the same time. "Tell me," Alice said, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Why are you all having a tea party at such an odd hour? It seems quite late for a party like this." The Hatter looked at her in astonishment, as though she had just asked the most ridiculous question. "Late? Late, my dear? There's no such thing as late in Wonderland. Time is just a figment of imagination here. It's always tea time. And if it's always tea time, then you can never have too much tea." The March Hare added enthusiastically, "That's right. You see, time doesn't make sense here. We just keep drinking, talking, and laughing, and it never ends. It's the best thing ever." His eyes widened as he poured even more tea into the cups, splashing some onto the table. Alice, growing more perplexed by the second, tried to make sense of it all. She thought back to the strange, dreamlike world she had fallen into. Every place, every person, and every event felt twisted, as though Wonderland had no clear boundaries. The Hatter's and Hare's strange logic was just another example of how everything in this world didn't seem to follow any set rules. As Alice sat in confusion, the conversation took yet another odd turn. The Hatter suddenly blurted, "Why is a raven like a writing desk?" He stared at Alice expectantly, waiting for her to respond. Alice, trying her best to understand the riddle, paused. "I don't know. Why? The Hatter grinned mischievously. I haven't the faintest idea, he laughed. It's just a question we ask. There's no answer to it. Wonderland is full of nonsense and riddles that don't have answers. Isn't that what makes it fun? Alice, somewhat relieved by the lack of an answer, smiled politely. I suppose that makes sense, she said, though she was still puzzled. Wonderland was, as she was slowly realizing, a place where logic had no place and nonsense ruled supreme. The tea party continued in a whirlwind of strange conversations, non-stop tea pouring, and chaotic antics. The dormouse, who had been sleeping soundly, suddenly woke up, only to fall asleep again moments later, mumbling incomprehensible things about the best cakes and the most wonderful dreams. Alice, though growing increasingly bemused and exhausted, felt herself swept up in the madness of the tea party. She had so many questions about this strange land and its bizarre inhabitants, but the answers seemed elusive, hidden behind layers of whimsy and absurdity. As much as she tried to keep up with the conversation, it felt like she was in a whirlwind, spinning with nonsense and endless riddles. She began to wonder how long she could stay at this surreal gathering before her mind turned into the same dizzying nonsense that surrounded her. And more importantly, what was she supposed to do next in this crazy world? The tea party seemed to go on forever, with no end in sight. It was as if time itself had been suspended, and Alice could hardly keep up with the pace of everything happening around her. But one thing was certain, Wonderland was a place that didn't follow any rules, and she was just beginning to understand how deep the madness truly went. After the chaotic, nonsensical tea party, Alice found herself wandering deeper into Wonderland, her mind still buzzing with the strange conversations and peculiar inhabitants she had encountered. She walked along a narrow path that seemed to wind through an almost magical forest, the trees towering over her, their twisted branches forming intricate patterns above her head. Everything around her felt unreal, like it was part of a dream or a distant memory. As Alice continued on, she came to a fork in the road. To her left was a path that appeared even more winding and overgrown, while to her right, a clearer path led deeper into the forest. Alice stood there, unsure of which way to go. It seemed like every path in Wonderland led to some strange or unexpected adventure, and she wasn't sure which route would take her to the answers she sought. As she stood, pondering the situation, a soft, almost magical voice suddenly spoke from above her. Not sure which way to go, are you? Startled, Alice looked around. She couldn't see anyone nearby, but the voice had definitely spoken to her. Slowly, she glanced upward, and to her amazement, she saw a large, grinning cat perched on a branch high above her. The cat's eyes glimmered with a mischievous gleam, and its wide grin seemed to stretch endlessly across its face. It was none other than the Cheshire Cat. The Cheshire Cat's smile widened even more as it noticed Alice's surprised expression. Don't be alarmed, the cat said, its voice smooth and calm. I'm just passing through. Alice, although accustomed to the oddities of Wonderland by now, couldn't help but be a little startled. She had never seen a cat quite like this before. It didn't seem to have any real body, only its floating head and its wide, toothy grin. The Cheshire Cat floated effortlessly in the air, its body vanishing and reappearing at will. Who are you? Alice asked cautiously, her curiosity piqued by this strange creature. Who am I? The cat grinned even wider. That's a question I often ask myself. It chuckled softly, its voice echoing mysteriously through the forest. But you, my dear, are the one who needs to figure that out. Wonderland has a funny way of making you think about who you are and where you're going. Alice blinked, trying to make sense of the cat's cryptic words. I'm Alice, she said, almost as if to remind herself. But I'm not sure where I'm supposed to be going. I don't even know where I am right now. The Cheshire Cat's grin grew even wider, and it floated lazily from one branch to another as if it were enjoying Alice's confusion. Ah, yes. That's the million-dollar question in Wonderland. Everyone is lost, and no one knows where they're going. But the good news is, you don't need to know. Alice was taken aback by this. I don't need to know? The Cheshire Cat nodded solemnly. Exactly. Because, you see, in Wonderland, it doesn't really matter where you're going. All that matters is the journey itself. It's all about finding your way through the madness, one step at a time. You'll get there when you get there. Or maybe not. Either way, it's all the same. Alice couldn't help but feel a little frustrated. It seemed like everyone in Wonderland spoke in riddles or nonsensical phrases. How was she supposed to understand anything in this strange place if nothing made sense? But I need to get to the right place, Alice insisted. I need to figure out how to leave. How do I get out of here? The Cheshire Cat's grin seemed to stretch impossibly wide, almost making Alice feel as though the grin itself was taking over her thoughts. Leaving? Well, you've got a lot of options, dear Alice. You could take the path to the left or the right. But neither one will take you anywhere you think you want to go. Alice felt a little disheartened by this. That doesn't make sense. I have to figure out where I'm going. The cat chuckled softly, its body gradually disappearing until only its head remained. Of course you do, my dear. But if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. Alice stood still for a moment, contemplating the Cheshire Cat's words. It seemed to her that everyone in Wonderland had a way of turning things upside down, forcing her to think in a way that felt unfamiliar. Everything here was a riddle, a puzzle that could never quite be solved. Wait, Alice said, suddenly struck by an idea. What about the Queen of Hearts? I've heard she's in charge of this place. Maybe she can help me. The Cheshire Cat's grin widened even further, and its eyes gleamed with a strange light. Ah, the Queen of Hearts, it mused. Now, there's a creature you might want to avoid, if you ask me. Why? Alice asked, now even more curious. The Cheshire Cat's grin seemed to turn into something more sinister. Because she's always angry. Always demanding, always yelling, always playing croquet with flamingos. And let's not even talk about her off with her head's business. The cat's voice lowered to a whisper as it added, but if you insist on meeting her, you'll find her in the royal garden. You might even get an invitation to her next croquet game. Alice thought about it for a moment. While the idea of meeting the Queen of Hearts didn't exactly sound appealing, it seemed like it might be the only way to find answers about Wonderland. After all, if the Queen ruled the land, surely she could offer some guidance, however strange or unpredictable that guidance might be. Well, Alice said, a little more determined now, I suppose I'll just have to face her, then. The Cheshire Cat smiled knowingly. Good luck, Alice. You'll need it. And with that, the cat began to fade, its grin lingering in the air long after its body had disappeared. As the last of the Cheshire Cat's smile faded into the misty air, Alice felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. She knew she had to continue her journey, even if Wonderland made no sense at all. The strange advice from the Cheshire Cat echoed in her mind. If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. Alice took a deep breath and began walking toward the royal garden, her steps uncertain but her resolve steady. Whatever lay ahead, she was determined to face it. She was beginning to understand that Wonderland was not a place to be understood in the way that the world she knew made sense. It was a place of contradictions, where the rules of logic were bent and everything was constantly shifting and changing. But Alice had already made it this far, and she was ready to see where the next step would take her. After a conversation with the Cheshire Cat, Alice felt a mix of confusion and resolve. The cat's cryptic advice seemed to imply that Wonderland didn't follow any particular rules or logic, but Alice was determined to make sense of the strange world around her. She decided to follow the cat's suggestion and make her way to the royal garden to meet the Queen of Hearts, hoping that the Queen, as the ruler of Wonderland, might have answers to her many questions. As Alice walked along the path, the landscape of Wonderland seemed to shift yet again. The vibrant, ever-changing scenery surrounded her, but it all seemed to be guiding her in one direction, toward the royal garden. She could hear voices in the distance, loud and sharp, carried by the wind, and the unmistakable sound of shouting and commands. Alice felt a twinge of unease, but her determination pushed her forward. She couldn't turn back now. After a few more steps, Alice found herself at the entrance to a large, sprawling garden. The gates were wide open, and through the archway, Alice could see the bright colors of blooming flowers, lush green grass, and perfectly manicured hedges. The atmosphere was oddly tense, and the sounds of raised voices only grew louder as Alice approached. As she stepped into the garden, she quickly realized that this was no ordinary garden. The hedges were arranged in intricate patterns, and in the distance, Alice could see a large group of people gathered at a clearing. At the center of the commotion was a group of guards, all dressed in red and white, holding what looked like large flamingos in their hands. Alice watched in surprise as they positioned the flamingos like croquet mallets and started to hit hedgehogs along the ground, using them as croquet balls. The scene was utterly absurd, and Alice couldn't help but feel bewildered by what she was witnessing. But the sight of the Queen of Hearts herself, seated on a large, extravagant throne, was enough to catch Alice's attention. The Queen was a large, imposing figure, dressed in bright red robes, her face fierce and unyielding. She was shouting orders at the game's players, her voice ringing through the garden like a sharp command. Every now and then, she would bellow at the guards, "Off with their heads!" her catchphrase that echoed ominously around the garden. Alice shuddered slightly at the thought of what would happen if the Queen ever directed that command toward her. As Alice made her way toward the Queen, she couldn't help but notice the bizarre atmosphere of the croquet game. The flamingos, which the players were using as mallets, squawked loudly as they were swung to hit the hedgehogs, who rolled awkwardly along the grass. The hedgehogs, for their part, seemed quite uncomfortable with their roles in the game, wriggling and trying to escape the clumsy hits. Alice felt as though she had stepped into a chaotic and surreal nightmare, a game with no rules, played by people and animals who seemed to care little about fairness. She was not sure whether she should be amused, horrified, or simply confused by it all. But she had to keep going. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to turn back now. "Excuse me," Alice called out as she approached the Queen's throne. "I'm Alice, and I've come to ask you for help. I'm very lost and—" The Queen of Hearts interrupted her with a shrill, "Who are you? What's your business here?" The Queen's eyes narrowed dangerously, and Alice immediately felt a sense of dread. There was no warmth in her tone, only a sharp, accusatory edge. Alice took a deep breath, doing her best to remain calm. "I'm Alice. I've come to see if you can help me. I've been wandering through Wonderland, and everything seems so strange. I don't know how to get back home, and I was hoping you might know the way." The Queen's expression softened ever so slightly, but her eyes remained as sharp as ever. "Help? You want my help?" she asked, her voice dripping with amusement. "You come into my garden, and now you want something from me? How dare you?" Alice froze, unsure of how to respond. It seemed that the Queen was not one to take kindly to being questioned, let alone ask for help. The Queen's gaze seemed to pierce through her, as if she were deciding what to do with Alice in that very moment. But before Alice could say another word, the Queen stood up and declared loudly, "I shall grant your request, on one condition." Alice, somewhat surprised by the Queen's sudden change in tone, leaned forward, eager to hear what she had to say. "What condition?" Alice asked, her voice filled with both caution and hope. The Queen's grin returned, stretching across her face like a wide, menacing smile. "You must play a game with me. A croquet game, of course." She gestured toward the chaotic scene unfolding in the garden. "But you will play by my rules, and if you do not win, I will have to take drastic measures. Do you understand?" Alice, taken aback, hesitated for a moment. The idea of playing such a ridiculous game, especially one where the rules seemed to change with each swing of the flamingo, was both bewildering and unsettling. But she knew that she had little choice. The Queen had power in this place, and if she was to stand any chance of finding answers, she would have to play along. "I understand," Alice said slowly, though the uncertainty in her voice was evident. The Queen's grin grew even wider, and she clapped her hands in delight. "Very well, let the game begin," she declared. Alice found herself thrust into the madness of Wonderland's version of croquet. The game, as she had already seen, was chaotic and absurd. The flamingos were awkwardly swung, the hedgehogs, though reluctant, were used as balls, and the rules seemed to change with every move. The players, mostly soldiers and other strange characters from Wonderland, seemed to have no sense of strategy or fairness, but rather played the game out of sheer madness. Alice was paired with one of the Queen's guards, a tall, thin man who looked just as confused as she felt. The flamingo was heavy in her hands, and she tried her best to strike the hedgehog in the right direction, but it kept squirming and rolling unpredictably. The Queen, sitting on her throne and watching the game, would occasionally shout her signature command, "Off with their heads," at anyone who made a mistake, sending a chill through the players. As the game wore on, Alice began to notice how the Queen's temper grew shorter. Every mistake, every slight imperfection in the game seemed to send her into a fit of rage. She demanded that everyone play perfectly, but it was impossible to win in such a chaotic game. Alice found herself both entertained and horrified by the whole situation, but the deeper she got into the game, the more she realized that the stakes were higher than she had initially thought. The Queen's unpredictable temper made her an even more fearsome figure than Alice had originally imagined. At one point, Alice even overheard a few players whispering about the Queen's infamous habit of ordering executions for the smallest of offenses. The idea of losing this game filled Alice with dread, but she had no choice but to continue. As the game progressed, Alice's mind began to wander. What was the Queen really like beneath her intimidating exterior? Was she truly as dangerous as the stories suggested? Was there any hope of escaping this madness, or had Alice stumbled into a world where the rules simply didn't apply? But there was no time to dwell on such thoughts. The game continued, and Alice was doing her best to survive it. The croquet game, chaotic and bizarre as it was, seemed to drag on endlessly. Alice did her best to participate, though her focus was more on the bizarre creatures and situations surrounding the game rather than the game itself. The Queen, in her constant fury, barked orders at everyone. Faster. Play harder. I want this game over now. The atmosphere was charged with tension, and the players were getting increasingly frantic, trying to follow the ever-changing whims of the Queen. It was clear that there was no way to win in such a ridiculous game, but Alice continued to play along, hoping that somehow she might make it through without upsetting the Queen. Suddenly, the game came to a halt. The Queen, looking more irate than ever, stood up from her throne and bellowed, "Enough! I have no time for this foolishness any longer. We have a much more important matter to attend to." Her sharp eyes swept over the crowd, and she pointed directly at Alice. "You there, the girl in the blue dress. You're coming with me. We're going to the trial." Alice felt a lump form in her throat. "A trial?" she asked, her voice shaky. The words sent a chill down her spine. What could possibly be happening now? The Queen's voice rang out, commanding, "Yes. A trial. You've seen enough nonsense in Wonderland to last a lifetime. Now it's time for some serious business." She motioned for the guards to escort Alice, who reluctantly followed behind, still trying to make sense of this strange world that had so far defied all reason. The trial was being held in a grand, open area in the middle of the royal gardens. The space was filled with odd-looking creatures who acted as witnesses and jurors. Alice saw creatures she had already encountered, like the white rabbit, the Cheshire cat, and the March hare, sitting on either side of a long, wooden table. Some were standing in the back, talking amongst themselves, while others simply watched the proceedings with disinterest. At the far end of the room, on a large raised platform, sat the Queen of Hearts, her throne adorned with bright red roses and her intimidating presence towering over everyone. "Bring her forward," the Queen called. Alice was ushered to the front of the room, where she stood nervously before the gathered crowd. The Queen of Hearts' stern gaze locked onto her, and Alice could feel the weight of her gaze on her very soul. "What is the charge?" the Queen demanded, her voice carrying an air of authority. The White Rabbit, who was acting as the court's herald, stood up and began to speak in a hurried, flustered manner. "The charge is the theft of tarts," he declared, holding up a large, crusty tart on a plate for everyone to see. "It is said that the accused, a little girl named Alice, has stolen the Queen's tarts." Alice blinked in confusion. "I don't understand," she protested. "I haven't stolen anything. I haven't even seen these tarts." The Queen of Hearts let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, don't play coy with me, child. Everyone in Wonderland knows that stealing tarts is a crime punishable by the most serious consequences. And that means Her voice trailed off menacingly as she raised a hand in the air and shouted, "Off with her head!" A shudder ran through Alice's body. She had heard the Queen's infamous words several times by now, but this time they seemed more ominous than ever. The entire room erupted into chaos, with the jurors whispering and the witnesses babbling in confusion. Alice felt the eyes of everyone on her, their gazes cold and unrelenting. It was clear that the Queen's temper was short, and the outcome of this trial would likely be anything but fair. Alice felt her heart race as the courtroom continued to buzz with noise. The White Rabbit nervously shuffled papers, the March Hare fidgeted in his seat, and the Cheshire Cat grinned lazily from the back, his wide, toothy smile somehow making everything feel even more surreal. The trial continued in what felt like an endless loop of absurdities. The Queen asked a few more bizarre questions, each one seeming more ridiculous than the last. Each witness she called forth gave nonsensical testimony that made no sense at all. The whole situation was as confusing as everything else in Wonderland. Alice spoke up, trying to make some sense of the madness. But this is all so absurd. None of this makes sense. The evidence isn't real, the witnesses are all ridiculous, and the charges are completely made up. The Queen's face turned crimson with rage. "How dare you!" she shrieked, her voice trembling with fury. "No one insults the court. No one insults me." "Off with her head!" the Queen screamed again, her eyes flashing with anger. At that moment, the situation seemed hopeless. Alice realized that in Wonderland, logic and reason didn't apply. The trial was a farce, the Queen was a tyrant, and the entire process was nothing but a sham. It felt as though Alice was trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. But as the Queen's guards moved toward her, Alice's resolve hardened. She wasn't going to let herself be swept away by the madness of this place. She had already faced so many bizarre challenges in Wonderland, and she had no intention of letting herself be defeated now. With a sudden burst of defiance, Alice stood up straight, her voice ringing out clear and loud. "You can't do this. This is ridiculous," she shouted. "This trial is a mockery, and you, Your Majesty, are the one who is out of control. You can't just have people executed for no reason." The Queen's face twisted with fury. "How dare you speak to me like that? Off with her head!" But Alice didn't back down. "No, I won't be silenced by you. I won't let you terrorize everyone in Wonderland." Her voice grew even stronger. "This isn't your Wonderland, it's everyone's Wonderland. And it's time you realize that you can't just order people around without reason." The room fell silent for a moment, and Alice's words seemed to hang in the air. The Queen's face turned an even deeper shade of red, but Alice stood her ground. It was as though something had snapped inside her. For the first time since arriving in Wonderland, she felt a sense of empowerment. The Queen glared at her for what felt like an eternity. For a moment, Alice thought the Queen might truly order her execution, but then something unexpected happened. The Queen raised her hand, her face a mixture of disbelief and rage, and for a fleeting moment, Alice thought the Queen might actually relent. But before Alice could process what was happening, the entire trial collapsed into chaos. The Queen of Hearts erupted in fury, and suddenly the courtroom was flooded with noise, confusion, and mayhem. Guards ran in every direction, shouting orders, while the witnesses screamed and scattered. The whole scene quickly devolved into madness, as it always did in Wonderland. In the midst of the pandemonium, Alice realized that perhaps her battle wasn't with the Queen alone. Perhaps her fight was with Wonderland itself, the chaos, the nonsensical rules, and the absurdity of it all. But she had made her stand, and for that moment, she had felt like she had control over her own fate. The trial had descended into chaos, just as Alice had expected. The Queen of Hearts, her face a mask of fury, screamed her usual command, "Off with her head." But this time, something was different. Instead of the usual swift, menacing action that followed her threats, everything around Alice seemed to spin out of control in a whirlwind of confusion. The guards, who were always somewhat bumbling and unsure of themselves, ran in circles, tripping over one another and failing to act with any real direction. The jurors, who had been strangely silent up until now, began shouting nonsensically. The witnesses, including the White Rabbit, the March Hare, and others, seemed to lose all composure, flailing their arms and running in opposite directions. Alice stood at the center of the chaos, feeling a mix of disbelief and defiance. Her outburst had caused the room to erupt, and she now realized the full extent of the madness that was Wonderland. The Queen of Hearts, once a seemingly powerful figure, was now a tyrant in the midst of her own implosion. The entire trial had turned into a surreal circus, a spectacle of madness that Alice could not have predicted. Alice took a deep breath, trying to steady her thoughts in the midst of the pandemonium. The Queen, her face now an unhinged combination of red and purple with rage, turned her gaze back toward Alice, who stood her ground. "You think you can defy me, little girl?" the Queen hissed, her voice trembling with rage. Alice's mind raced, trying to think of a way out. She had already faced countless absurdities, yet this felt different. The Queen of Hearts was a figure of authority in Wonderland, and yet Alice couldn't help but wonder whether the Queen had any real power at all. Wonderland itself seemed like a place where logic and reason were discarded entirely. And if that was the case, then maybe Alice had a chance. Before Alice could respond, the courtroom descended into further chaos. The White Rabbit, in a state of panic, darted across the room, muttering to himself as he tried to flee. The Cheshire Cat, who had been watching the proceedings with a detached amusement, vanished from sight, only to reappear with a wide grin on his face, sitting on the shoulders of one of the guards, who was now completely bewildered. Alice saw her opportunity. The whole court was distracted. The Queen was livid, shouting incoherent orders at the guards and jurors, and the atmosphere was one of complete disarray. It seemed like no one was in control. The trial was a mockery, and Wonderland itself was slipping deeper into its own absurdity. As Alice turned to leave the scene, she caught sight of the door to the courtroom. It was wide open, and no one seemed to be paying attention to her anymore. She hesitated for a moment, weighing her options. Could she really just walk away from all this? Could she leave Wonderland and return to the world she knew? But even as she stood there, she knew she couldn't abandon the journey now. She had come so far, and Wonderland was a place that demanded answers, whether she was ready for them or not. She could feel the pull of the unknown, drawing her deeper into the land of madness. With a sudden burst of determination, Alice stepped out of the courtroom, leaving the chaos of the trial behind her. She didn't look back. There was no need to. Wonderland had already proven that it had no rules, no logic to follow, and she was done trying to make sense of it all. It was time to stop questioning and start experiencing. As Alice walked through the garden, the shrill cries of the Queen of Hearts could still be heard behind her. The Queen's threats were growing more distant, but Alice couldn't shake the feeling that the Queen was always lurking nearby, watching her every move. The garden ahead was vast, and Alice began to wonder what was waiting for her next. Wonderland was an unpredictable land, full of contradictions and surprises. She had encountered some of the most bizarre creatures imaginable, and yet there was something oddly comforting about the idea that there was still more to discover. She couldn't help but think that perhaps the answer to Wonderland's mysteries lay not in trying to make sense of them, but in simply embracing the chaos. As Alice ventured further, she came across a large, peculiar house. The structure was unlike anything she had ever seen: twisted windows, crooked doors, and a roof that seemed to sag under its own weight. But there was something intriguing about it. The house seemed to be waiting for her, as though it were inviting her inside. But just as she was about to approach the door, a loud voice echoed from inside. "Who goes there?" Alice froze, startled. She glanced around, trying to determine the source of the voice. It wasn't the Queen or any of the other inhabitants she had met so far. This voice was deeper, more grounded, and full of mystery. "I am Alice," she called out, her voice steady but cautious. The door creaked open slightly, and from within, a figure emerged. It was a tall, imposing figure, clad in rich, flowing robes. He had a regal presence, but there was something almost ethereal about him. His eyes, however, were what caught Alice's attention, glowing with an intense, almost unnatural light. "Ah, Alice," the figure said, his voice calm and deep. "I've been waiting for you." Alice, unsure of how to react, took a cautious step forward. "Waiting for me?" she asked. "Who are you?" The figure smiled knowingly, though there was something otherworldly about his expression. "I am the caterpillar, and I have much to share with you about this place." The caterpillar's presence was both calming and unnerving, and for the first time since entering Wonderland, Alice felt as though she were truly standing at the edge of something important. The journey, it seemed, was far from over. As Alice stood before the caterpillar, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. Wonderland had already proven itself to be a place where nothing was as it seemed, where rules were mere suggestions, and logic was turned upside down. But the caterpillar, regal, enigmatic, and calm, seemed like he held the key to understanding everything that had been happening. The caterpillar looked at Alice with eyes that seemed to pierce through her, as if seeing straight into her soul. "You've come a long way, Alice," he said in a voice that was both soothing and unsettling. "But you have not yet understood the nature of Wonderland. You are here because you are meant to be. But you must decide whether you will continue to seek answers or embrace the absurdity." Alice frowned, her thoughts swirling. She had been through so much in this strange land: bizarre characters, chaotic trials, a nonsensical croquet game, and yet she still felt like a stranger here. "I don't understand," she admitted. "How do I make sense of this place? I thought the Queen might give me answers, but it's all madness. Everything is upside down." The caterpillar's eyes softened, and he took a long, slow drag from his hookah before responding. "You see, Wonderland is not about making sense. It never was. It is a place of change, a place where everything is fluid. Here, the rules change as quickly as the wind. What you seek is not knowledge of this world, but the understanding of how to navigate it, to move through the chaos without losing yourself in it." Alice's mind was racing. But how do I do that? She asked desperately. How do I find my way in a world where nothing makes sense? The caterpillar smiled, as though he had been expecting this question all along. The answer, Alice, is simpler than you think. You are already doing it. The key to Wonderland lies not in trying to impose logic, but in embracing the unknown. Accept that there is no right or wrong way to navigate this place. There is only the journey and the choice to move forward without fear. You must stop fighting the madness and learn to dance with it. Alice stood silent for a moment, taking in the caterpillar's words. It was true, she had been trying so hard to make sense of Wonderland, to understand its strange characters and nonsensical rules. But perhaps the only way to truly live here was to accept it as it was, without the need for order or reason. The caterpillar was right. Wonderland was a world of chaos and fluidity, and there was no point in trying to force it into the framework of the real world. But just as Alice was beginning to grasp this new understanding, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The world around her shimmered and wavered, as though it were slipping away like a dream. Alice, the caterpillar said, his voice no longer calm, but urgent. You must choose now. You can stay here, in Wonderland, forever lost in its madness, or you can return to the world you know. The decision is yours. Alice looked around, feeling the pull of Wonderland tugging at her, but at the same time, she felt the familiar weight of reality calling her back. She had spent so much time here, and she had learned so much about herself, about courage, about acceptance, about embracing the unknown, but she realized that she couldn't stay forever. Wonderland was not her home, and it wasn't meant to be. I understand, Alice said quietly, her voice filled with resolve. It's time to go back. The caterpillar nodded solemnly, and the world around Alice began to dissolve. The garden, the caterpillar, and the swirling chaos of Wonderland faded into a blur of colors and light. For a moment, Alice felt as though she were floating, suspended between two worlds. Then, in an instant, she was back. Alice opened her eyes to find herself lying on the riverbank, just where she had started her journey. The sun was shining brightly overhead, and the soft rustling of the leaves in the wind sounded peaceful and familiar. She blinked, looking around in confusion, but everything seemed normal. There were no bizarre creatures, no talking flowers, no raging queens. Her sister, who had been sitting beside her earlier, was now reading her book again, as if nothing had happened. Alice sat up, brushing the grass from her dress, her heart still racing with the memory of her wild adventure. Alice, her sister said, glancing up from her book. Where did you go? Alice smiled, a quiet understanding settling over her. She hadn't gone anywhere physically, but her mind had journeyed to a place where anything was possible. She had been through Wonderland, seen its wonders and its madness, and she had learned something invaluable, that the journey was more important than the destination. I was just daydreaming, Alice replied softly. But I think it's time I head home now. Her sister raised an eyebrow, but said nothing more. Alice stood up, brushing off her skirt, feeling the weight of the real world pressing gently against her shoulders. Wonderland might have been a place of chaos and contradiction, but it had also been a place of revelation. She knew now that she had the strength to face whatever came next, no matter how strange or unpredictable life might be. As Alice walked away from the riverbank, she glanced back once more, but Wonderland was gone. It was just a dream, a memory. And yet, As she smiled to herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that Wonderland would always be with her, tucked away in her heart, a place where she could return to whenever she needed to. That's the story of Alice in Wonderland. Hopefully this story can help you sleep. Good night.